started. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to the Future of Food, Extreme Possibilities of Genetic Engineering. This series builds on the theme of this year's Wicked Problems, Wolfpack Solutions course for all incoming students, which dealt with questions such as how do we produce enough food for a growing population, and how can we distribute food equitably? Also, how will we produce food in the future? And Professor Barrangou was one of the faculty presenters for the course, talking about CRISPR, and that is viewable on the YouTube channel for the class. So this series that we're taking part in has already addressed alternative protein sources such as plants and fungi in Meat 2.0, and how insects are a sustainable and high-quality source of protein. That was edible insects. Did anyone come to edible insects and eat of the insects? Okay. That was subtitled Nothing to be Afraid of, by the way. Today we'll talk about the future of genetically engineered foods, and we'll think a little bit about what we're already doing with genetically engineered foods, what might be possible in the future, and also maybe what should we do. And the point of this panel is to be cross-disciplinary, so we'll be having a conversation in a Q&A format until around 5:15, and then we're going to open the floor to your questions. So please think about questions. The crazier, the better, as far as I'm concerned. This is also going to be live streaming on YouTube, so if you are watching out there in the YouTubeverse and have questions, you can also put them in the chat, and they will be reported to us. So I'm going to briefly introduce myself, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to do the same and to say a little bit about themselves and what brings them to the table here. My name is Marsha Gordon. I'm a professor and the director of the Film Studies program at NC State. I've been doing programs with the Science Communicators of North Carolina called Science in the Movies for many years now, where I sit on a panel with a bunch of scientists, and I know nothing about the science, and they know relatively little about the film, and we talk about the way movies imagine science. And so I have an interest in talking across the disciplines about especially the representation of science in the movies. So I will pass the baton this way.
Hello, everyone. I am Rafeeat Aliyu. I am a second-year MFA student. I major creative writing. I write speculative fiction, which includes fantasy, science fiction, and horror. And as someone who writes science fiction, I'm definitely interested in what the future of food will look like. I imagine it a lot in my writings. I've been on 2 panels so far in creative writing spaces, talking about food in fiction, food in science fiction, food in fantasy, and how that looks like. So this will be my first time actually speaking with people who are experts on the subjects, rather than just keeping it with my fellow writers and talking about what we like about food. So passing it on to the experts.
Okay, I'm Heike Sedorov. I'm a professor here at NC State in the Department of Plant Microbial Biology, and I make genetically engineered plants, crops, all kinds of, even algae, everything that does photosynthesis. So mostly with the goal of improving sustainability, but also just very basic research to understand how they can actually respond to the environment and even sense the environment. So there's a lot of cool horror stories that can come out of these things.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rodolphe Barrangou. I'm a distinguished professor in the Department of Food, Bioprocessing, and Nutrition Sciences. I've been doing this for 10 years, and before that, I was in the real world, working at a large Fortune 50 company as a director of R&D, also using CRISPR in a commercial setting. So I teach, I run the CRISPR lab. We're doing a lot of CRISPR research, a lot of CRISPR technology development, a lot of CRISPR deployment towards real world examples, some real right now, some maybe fictional for the future. A lot of excitement for sure. And on the side, I'm also an entrepreneur, and I've been the co-founder of 5 different CRISPR startup companies that are using that technology in different realms, including human therapeutics, including food, including ag, including forestry. So I very much look forward to talking about the science and the fiction, the present and the future, probably not much the past, of genome editing and all its potential across different industries for the enhancement of human health and human life and by extension, that of the world.
Great. Well, I get to ask the first question. Most of my questions are going to blend my science fiction movie context with asking questions about the way things work in the real world of science, about which I know relatively little. So I want to start by thinking about the way most science fiction films represent food. And so many of them depicted as completely functional. Gels and powders and liquids, units. And in The Matrix, for example, it's this pale mush. Those of you who have seen The Matrix, which I suspect many of you might remember that, they describe it as everything your body needs, a single-celled protein combined with synthetic aminos, vitamins, and minerals. But it's a mush, right? So in the genetically engineered food future being mapped out now by people like you too, how is taste and pleasure being considered or ignored? When scientists are working on genetically engineered food science, how and when do these notions enter the conversation? And will anyone ever be able to genetically engineer or lab grow a tomato that actually tastes as good as one from the farmer's market in July? Because as of right now, I don't feel like that's possible. These are my questions.
You want to say?
I'll take the first shot at this. So as a food scientist and professor in food science, certainly we understand that the sensory attributes of foods are first and foremost, right? I mean, nutrition matters. Nutrition is important. But consumers consume food and oftentimes are repeat consumers of the same products because of their sensory attributes. It's the color, it's the taste, it's the flavor, it's the texture and combinations thereof. So unless we have the ability to account for that when we develop next generation foods, we don't want mush, we don't want synthetic food necessarily that comes out of a heavily processed environment. And as a matter of fact, there's companies already here in RTP, like Pairwise Plants, who's working on the genome editing of not just plants, but as a matter of fact, not just crops, as a matter of fact, fruits and vegetables. So they're more flavorful, so they're more enjoyable, so they're more colorful to some extent. We've seen some of the samples, not from Pairwise Plants, just outside the door right here. And accounting for the sensory attributes of products for consumers to enjoy and be repeat consumers is first and foremost. Trying to balance that with the nutritional attributes and the health promoting attributes is the challenge, but is the opportunity. And already today, genome editing, genetic engineering, breeding, natural or scientifically enhanced, is very much accounting for that.
Okay.
And it's the history of food, you know? I mean, there were wars fought. there have been people enslaved for just producing foods to improve flavors and places where you can grow them and really quantities. So when you think about bananas, they didn't look the way they do today. You know, apples didn't look 100 years ago the way or 1,000 years ago, the way they look today. Your tomatoes were toxic when they first found them in the high Andes and then brought them down. And now, you know, tomatoes compared to their original tomato, which was tiny little green, very bitter and toxic tomato, are already pretty amazing, even if you find that, and I agree with you, that some store-bought things lose a lot. So that's all breeding, selection, mutation and selection. That's all it is. That's what the peanuts were. And so genetic engineering, I don't think is going to be much different. So to me, genetic engineering is just a technology. Breeding has advanced enormously, so we can do a lot more. I shouldn't say we because I can't do it, but a lot more can be done with breeding much faster now. Genetic engineering can go across species, so that's something that is harder to do with breeding. CRISPR can do just about anything, and so I don't think it's a new topic. I will say the mush you're talking about, because I have little visitors, and I was reminded of when my kids were little, you know, you feed them mush. Mm-hmm. You know, these little glasses with mush when they can't chew, they have mush. And then the other group that actually works with the nutritious mush, developing nutritious mush, is NASA. you know, because there's your science fiction, because they need food on long duration space missions, which will all be produced by bacteria and fungi, because plants, you can't, it's a nice movie again, but that's not really doable. And so I wouldn't say no to mush, but I think people like what is there already, and flavor is top, and texture. You know, you need to bite into a tomato or an apple that's crispy and not mush. You know,
Crispy and crisper.
crispy.
But to go on the specific example of tomatoes or tomatoes, they are already on the market right now, as a matter of fact, both in Japan and in the UK, genome-edited tomatoes and tomatoes, respectively, that are accessible to the market. And the scientists have enhanced them, and the regulators have approved them, and the consumers are consuming them. I haven't traveled to Japan or to the UK as of yet with the pandemic, but I very much look forward to sinking my own teeth into a real tomato that's been genome edited to taste for myself how interesting or objectionable it may be, at least from a flavor standpoint.
So is the promise of that tomato that it is revolutionizing, it's not the pale, mushy, hard tomato of the supermarket? That's the premise, it's a farmer's market tomato, pretty much?
Yeah, they're trying to bring back the heirloom tomato
Yeah.
flavor, but the nutritional composition right now is the number one enhancement. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And on the cover of an issue of the New York Times magazine, there is a purple tomato that was genome edited for color purposes and flavor purposes. But I haven't tasted that one either, and this one is not on the market yet. And as far as I know, again, our friends at Pairwise Plants down the street are looking at commercializing some of their first generation CRISPR vegetables, possibly as early as 2023 or 2024.
If I could just ask one follow-up question to that. So is it in Japan and in England because it can't be brought here yet? Or what are the regulatory steps? Is that the hurdle? Is that why it's starting there? Because I think of England as having fairly strict regulatory systems.
So as a matter of fact, they do have strict regulatory constraints. But there's a geopolitical play in the UK now not being part of the EU anymore. They're not subjected to the EU-based regulations and regulatory constraints that apply to genome editing technologies, as a matter of fact. Still to this date, though it will change in time, hopefully for them. The UK government has invested significantly into genome editing technologies as a nation, and wants to be the leading genome editing player in Europe. It's going to be harder to catch up with the rest of the world, like the US and China, obviously. And in some cases, companies decide to market some of their products in one particular test market. So how quickly and how easily and how broadly and how successfully those tomatoes will find themselves to us, I think is yet to be determined. And I was just at a meeting last week in DC with USDA and EPA and FDA, the F part of FDA, talking about the future regulatory frameworks in an era where the White House released just 3 weeks ago tomorrow, as a matter of fact, the new executive order directing the regulatory agencies to update the framework to support the buildup of the bioeconomy. So that's very much in play as well.
Interesting. Thank you.
I had a follow-up question as well with the genome engineered tomatoes. I was curious, like, do you have any idea how they're marketed to consumers? Do consumers know that these are genetically modified, or are they just like marketed as plain tomatoes?
So again, I haven't seen them. I don't think they have a label on them.
All right.
So I don't think it's a genome edited label. But the companies that have developed them and the regulators that have approved them have very openly, very overtly, very clearly condoned those products. And as a matter of fact, some of those companies are branding themselves as disruptors and innovators in the space. So much like an impossible food, right, is very proud of their genetic engineering to make what sounds impossible possible and hopefully flavorful. We can have that discussion again, but plant was discussed in the previous panel here. the ownership of the genome editing space is very important from a marketing standpoint to those companies.
I'm mostly asking because I was in the UK over the summer, so I'm wondering, did I eat tomatoes that I didn't know? But all the tomatoes I ate there tasted good, so.
Would you care?
Sorry?
Would you care?
Oh, I would, yeah. I would eat it, yeah, out of curiosity. All right, so my first question had to do with diversity, and it's following up from Marsha's question about that nutritional mush, right? Given I'm Nigerian, but I'm just thinking like almost everyone here would eat food from like different cultures. So I was curious to know, like, we have this idea of like in science fiction and futuristic foods being tasteless and functional, which doesn't have to be, right? And I thought, okay, when the food is flavored, it's usually like, maybe it's a sludge that tastes like mashed peas or something, right? So I wondered, like, where do diverse palates fit in the future of food engineering? Could we eat maybe not curries or fufu, but but maybe sludge-flavored curries in the future?
So flavor enhancement, maybe I'll take a first shot here. So flavor enhancement is very important. I mean, the whole food industry is about flavor, sometimes about color. You can add flavors that don't exist in nature to a particular product. So I love coffee. We have a coffee house right behind us here. When I go and get my latte, I like a flavored latte, right? Whether it's hazelnut or vanilla or mocha or cinnamon. The season is going to come up soon, right? I like to add flavor to my coffee. Those coffee beans don't come out flavored. Naturally. It doesn't mean that they don't taste good. They are bitter, right? I like the bitterness to some extent, but not too much. But I think people are using chemicals. Hopefully moving forward, they'll be using more biologicals to enhance the flavor experience of the foods that we consume, be they on the natural spectrum or the mush synthetic biology process spectrum. I think flavor to me is very important, and without enhanced flavor, without appetizing flavor, and color matters, of course, texture. It's just not the same thing whatsoever.
I think when we go to coffee, the bigger issue is not what's the flavor for all the coffees, but right now coffee has a fungus. And so right now what is the much bigger problem is to get enough coffee growing, because this fungus is really reducing the amount of output. And the question is, do you really rather want vanilla and cinnamon and whatever flavored coffee beans when you can add the flavor with your oat milk or whatever you have? Or do you want coffee at all? So I think the priorities right now in this entire genetic engineering and CRISPRing space, the flavor enhancement and nutritional enhancement is one aspect, but I think the bigger one is really protection from disease, protection from extreme environments where you have really a question of, do you get enough wheat? Do you get enough of a certain component that you're used to eating, cacao? If you like cacao, it's critical, it's difficult. So climate change is really putting the biggest pressure, at least in my field, on genetic engineering. Flavor is important, but really secondary. It may be good for some markets, but if you can't buy an apple, then it doesn't matter if it's mushy or CRISPR.
Crisp and CRISPR.
Couldn't help it.
So on that note, I think it's important, again, we're answering the question as is asked, but to get perspective on prioritization of the army of scientists working on breeding and CRISPR biology, CRISPR science, CRISPR applications, what we're seeing in the ag world is the same thing that we're seeing in the therapeutics world. It starts with disease.
It starts with disease.
It starts with disease, pest, right? And we're using CRISPR in humans to cure genetic disease. But the questions are, mentioned in movies, whether it's Gattaca or others, right? Human enhancement, changing the eye color, the hair color, the skin color, traits like height, or maybe even BMI or muscles, longevity, of course, intelligence and the like, however it is defined, right, is always mesmerizing the audience. But long before we have the ability to enhance traits that are defined by very complex genetic pathways and circuits, people will take a single gene responsible for a disease and correct that, right? a single base change that's responsible for human genetic disease can be corrected using CRISPR, and those are the first, the second, the third, the 10th, the 100th application in line, and it's the same in food and ag.
Right.
People are looking at yield, drought resistance, pest resistance, fungal resistance, insect resistance, bacterial infection resistance, heat resistance, frost resistance,
All of
and the
these
like.
result in yield.
And
Yes.
all those are sometimes well-established genetic traits that we've discovered through breeding sometimes that we can now replicate through editing. So those are the priorities. And eventually we'll get to flavor and texture and nutritional composition and protein composition and lipid composition and enhancement. But we're not quite there yet, or it's not a strategic priority at this point in time.
Well, I think in some ways that's a good segue to a really important part of this conversation, which is ethics. And of course, science fiction, writing, and film is almost always about the ethics of the worlds that are created by the author or director. And often those texts ask us to think about consequences, unintended especially, right? I'm thinking about Minority Report and Blade Runner, Jurassic Park, which is probably a really relevant example right now with what's going on with mammoths, Children of Men, and so on. So as scientists, what are the ethical questions that you ask yourselves as it pertains to genetically engineered food? Do you stay up at night sometimes thinking about possible unintended consequences, or do you sleep easy knowing that nothing possibly could go wrong with the work that you're doing?
I sleep well, thank you.
It's because you're not drinking enough coffee.
That's a good one. No, I think we are very well aware of those potential consequences. We are also, I am at least, and I'm sure Rodolphe is too, and others, very well aware of how small certain risks are compared to other risks. When you take risks in life, the things that we make in the lab, we can estimate it. It's not perfect, and we could be wrong always, you know? But you get in your car, I think you have a bigger risk. Now, these are population risks, so we put many more people at risk if really something goes wrong. But that's where, with not only is it our technology that is advancing, the technology to analyze this, the technology to figure out what did we change in the chemicals in these organisms, what did we change in the structure that could affect a human or an insect, or you know the story with the monarch butterflies and all these things. You know what could possibly be a consequence? And we have here at NC State in the GES, Genetic Engineering and Society Center, people who only, or not only, but mostly really focus on those questions. So those are concerns, but those are, I think the risks I feel, at least in the food field. Now, in the medical field that Rodolphe works on, that I think there are very different risks and ethics involved. But in our field, I think it's a moderate risk, and we are trying to analyze it the best we can and put it out. I think it's as high or low as any new banana variety that has been bred, you know.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, I mean, on my end, so I sleep very well as well. This does not keep me up at night. There's other things that keep me up, but that's not it. The way I think about it is like the who, the when, the where, the how, what they're doing, how they're doing it. That does not make me nervous whatsoever. There are some risks to manage, and places like the Genetic Engineering Center at NC State do a very good job at being aware of risk management and risk assessment and responsible research and innovation and frameworks that go with that to really understand the implications ethically, practically, and from a regulatory standpoint for the consumers, whether they're patients or food consumers. What concerns me is not the technology. What concerns me is not the products. What concerns me is the people doing it. So technology in and of itself is neither good nor bad, beneficial or detrimental. It's how it's used and deployed. And the part of that process that would keep me up at night or makes me concerned when I'm awake is the user. And it's people not taking seriously the risk management part. And there's about 8 million scientists on planet Earth. And it takes a small percentage of those people to do stupid or unintended things. And there's 8 million risks that we're taking with scientists, and some of those people will do bad things, intended or not. And we've had examples in the CRISPR realm when it comes to human breeding and engineering. So we know that can happen. But it's not technology driven, it's the people who are using that technology. And then what doesn't concern me again is the relative amount of risk that it poses to a population when we understand the risk, we understand the regulation, we understand the commercialization, we understand the risk assessment and management and regulatory frameworks. What concerns me is how we talk about the science and our scientific shortcomings with regards to telling compelling stories. So that's what I love about movies and storytellers, right? With motion pictures is very powerful means to trigger reactions and thoughts in the brains of the viewer, to kind of, compel the viewership to think and imagine fiction or real scenarios, and sometimes they intermingle with each other. And you think about, wow, what would I do? Or what do I think about this extreme engineering case? And I think that most of those 8 million scientists, I only know a handful of them, right? But the ones that I know oftentimes are not very good at explaining the science. Maybe teaching at NC State is fine. But like communicating about the science, telling stories to people who are not scientifically trained, trying to rationalize to people in general audience why they do things as opposed to what they're doing or how they're doing it. That's why they're teachers, right? And PR people. I think that's the challenge. And that keeps me awake, as a matter of fact, because I'm very concerned with our limited ability and limited training, as a matter of fact, for scientists to go into the real world and share those stories. And oftentimes, the more scientists talk, the worse team science looks, especially at a time of scientific skepticism, anti-science bias, misinformation and disinformation. Those things keep me up at night a lot more, or keep me awake in the middle of the day in need of coffee. A lot more so than the real risk of the actual product itself.
Yeah.
I mean, and let's face it, as someone who gets a lot of her science from science fiction, a good plot does not usually involve everything going right? So you have to have something going wrong in order to have a good story. And so you tend to have dystopian imaginations of, how science gets used to nefarious purposes or unintended consequences. And so,
Or a lot of movies start with a scientist who figures something out and nobody believes him or her. You know? All these catastrophes that come when meteorites come in because somebody didn't listen to the scientist.
All right. So my next question had to do with, because we've touched a bit on, Asian food and lost food and history of food, right? So I was curious to know, what are the possibilities of engineering foods that, are already extinct? I think Rodolphe mentioned, creating flavors that don't even exist currently, right? So, how about bringing foods that were popular once in the past but are no longer basically here. I read stuff about the Judean date palm, which used to grow near the Dead Sea, and a passenger pigeon, which was popular in North America, but was apparently so tasty that it's gone extinct. So will it be possible to bring back foods that used to exist but aren't anymore?
I mean, absolutely, right?
I think the challenge then, think just to yesterday. So the Nobel Prize was awarded to the guy.
Svante Pääbo.
Thank you. The Swedish scientist who was most famous. He did a lot of very cool stuff. I want to say that, but the most famous thing is he sequenced the Neanderthal genome. So if we have a genome, there's no question that Neanderthal could be recreated. I don't know why you would want to do that. That's a different story, maybe for a movie.
Yes, that's a good
if you need a Neanderthal, you can make one. There are projects that try to do mammals, and you probably know more projects than that. It's a question who pays for it. If there's a public interest in having these, is there science to be learned about, or is there a benefit? I think it's not about what can we do, because quite frankly, given enough time and resources, we can do a lot. You know, I don't want to say everything, but really a lot. But why would we? So I think that's the first question. Do you really want to have a Neanderthal? I mean, maybe funny for us, but for this poor little Neanderthal coming into our world, it would be pretty rough.
So I think I agree 100%. So what can we do? I mean, arguably our imagination is the limiting factor, which is for good or for bad, depending on the creativity of the director, the movie maker, or the author, or this crazy scientist in the story. So it can be done with the right resources, the right amount of time, the right investments, obviously. So possibilities are almost imagination bound. De-extinction is real. Like the use of CRISPR to de-extinct the woolly mammoth is real. Trying to bring back genotypes that don't exist anymore to replicate them because we can sequence them is very real at a time of ancient DNA sequencing per the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine yesterday with Svante Pääbo. So those things are fundamentally more close to reality than fiction when it comes to feasibility. The question is not, could we do it? The question is, should we do it? And I could make a joke and say, well, if we do bring one back, we should bring two back so they can keep each other company and figure it out and breed if they want to. But that's a joke, right? That's not a serious answer. So the point is, why would we want to do that? What's the rationale behind that?
And
What's
is
the
it
argument
ethical?
for?
Is it ethical?
What's the arguments against? What are the consequences, intended or unintended? And if you're going to bring back Neanderthal, then there's a whole other list of other extinct species that should come long before that.
A Homo
That
sapiens.
we're going to bring back, right? And forget about humans and hominids for a minute, but how about like corals,
Yeah.
the Great Barrier Reef, right? Or how about the extinction of animals that
Or
have
the
a
American
purpose?
chestnut.
The American chestnut, we love trees, right? Maybe the original heirloom tomato after it was bitter, when it was sweet, before it got undesirable and bred for size and price per pound as opposed to nutritional value and taste. So I think that's the real question: is what's the intent, what's the purpose, what's the rationale for, and then at the same time, what are the arguments against? What are the consequences? What are the risks? And whom in society decides what's acceptable or not? Whose opinions matter the most or not? Do we vote on that? Do we trust the experts? Do we empower and deputize a smaller group of people to decide on our behalf? Where does that discussion occur? How is it legislated and regulated? And there's a lot of contextual dimensionalities that really impact those kinds of thought processes. And we're much better off making movies about it. Crazy, real crazy movies.
You still
right?
need money to make a movie.
It's cheaper than doing the science. And then have the conversation as a population. And say, well, what do you think is agreeable or objectionable? What do you think is feasible or impossible?
But are those conversations, they strike me as not really happening, right? I mean, in every country is kind of its own island of, maybe it's okay to do this in Korea or, in Italy, but not in the United States. So that's one of the problems, right, is that there's no global consensus on this. And obviously, if you create things and put them in the world,
They can hop on a plane.
They can
The
hop on a
Neanderthal can go to Korea,
Exactly.
yes.
Exactly.
Yep. But I think there are two, what we have to distinguish, and that was since the beginning of genetic engineering, the thing, you have private companies who don't require any public discussion. They can do what they want. They theoretically can do what they want. So they don't have the same oversight. Once they want to release it, it's a different story. But when it comes to research, if they have a mammoth in their lab, they have a mammoth in their lab, and then we'll figure out what to do. Publicly funded work really different, because here you have political pressure, which is, if we stay a democratic country, determined by that. And then the big funding agencies, NSF or DOE and USDA, who else funds? DOD.
FDA.
Yeah. They,
NIH.
NIH, yes, in Rodolphe's case. And so that funding is determined in part politically, and which would be theoretically as a background democratic, and then by experts. The scientists review their own, it's peer review, so we review our own, we go on panels and review our colleagues' proposals and then say what should be funded and what not. And then there are directives that come down, but it's a peer review system among scientists, essentially.
So Marsha, so I agree with your concern about the absence of a formalized international global framework that enables everybody to weigh in on the matter, right? There's a few forums here and there, a few meetings here and there, some opinions published in scientific literature here and there. If we think of team science as a amorphous but cohesive community to some extent, there are things that scientists do, like put in a moratorium, a self-imposed moratorium. We all agree we should not do that. That actually occurred after J.K. Hay allegedly bred CCR5 human mutants, twins in China. So it was objectionable for many reasons that are obvious to most scientists and should be obvious to the world. And Team CRISPR and Team International Science got together and said, we're going to have a moratorium. This is unacceptable. This is objectionable. It's should not be done. It should not be condoned. Rogue agent, bad actor, and he has served a jail sentence in China. Again, I'm not going to comment on that. So there are informal ways to do that. But to me, you cannot limit that conversation to scientists. You should not limit that conversation to scientists. You have to have regulators. You have to have key opinion leaders. But you have to have the public involved. You have to have religious groups involved. You have to have consumer advocacy groups involved. You have to have all kinds of different vested interests opine on the matter. And then collectively we can decide, well, what should we do and how should we do it? But the challenge is that to organize that, formalize that, takes forever, right? And then who decides where and when and how is geopolitically complicated. And we need more responsible ways to do this. So think of like WHO or the UN or organizations like this that really serve a global purpose for the world's population, sometimes doing efforts like this. But how actionable, how implementable, and their ability to regulate and legislate and enforce those opinions are very bound. I mean, this is how wars happen and crimes against humanity happen.
You also need to be careful because there are really organizations that actually make money off opposing this. There is money in false information. There's money in that. So it's a difficult process to see who is really a good actor and who's a bad actor here. Who has an interest in really bringing the topic forward and who is making money on refusing this. We have this case of the golden rice, which was one of the oldest one, and really, in my mind, a brilliant solution to what was needed to save lives, millions of lives. And there was no good reason in holding it back scientifically. There was no good reason in holding it back from a legal standpoint because Syngenta made this publicly available. And it was really I would call it a propaganda war that has cost a lot of people their lives for rice, So it's very difficult. I don't want to see everybody on the table because I don't think everybody has a good intent here.
Well, and also, bureaucracy can be the enemy of innovation, right, as well.
Sure.
So you've got a tension between, wanting to have a conversation and accountability and miring everything in an impossible to navigate bureaucracy, which is a whole other form of dystopia. So.
True.
Okay, now I'm going to ask a question that I really can't wait to hear the answer to. I want you both to blow our minds with telling us something that in our lifetimes, of course, you cannot be psychic about how long our lifetimes will be, but in our, let's say, within the next, call it 30 to 50 years, what's something that you think is on the horizon that we have no idea is in the realm of possible, or if you want to say in the next 5 years, make it more short term. Don't worry about bureaucracies and regulation, but what's something that you think is in the realm of possible in the world of genetically engineered foods that, that will make us excited, horrified, thrilled, gasp, whatever reaction you'd like to get?
So sustainable agriculture, I mean, that's underway, right? So we're working on genome-edited trees, which are arguably the most complex genomes on the planet. Some of those trees have genomes that are 10 times larger than ours. So think about like extreme genetic engineering. Those genomes are much more complex. They're much bigger. They're much less known. They're much harder to manipulate. They take a lot longer to grow, right? And we're already several years into genome editing trees to breed a more sustainable forest to address global warming, amongst other things. But in the context of food, let's just talk about trees that we use for edible products, right? Whether they're fruits or nuts. And nuts for a great example because nuts are very inefficient in terms of water usage and sustainability. So think of all the nuts that you like to enjoy that are healthy for you, that are difficult or to afford, or difficult to grow, or difficult to procure because they're not affordable, because they're inefficient with regards to water usage or land usage, right? Almonds and cashews are some of my favorites, right? But all the fruits that we like oftentimes that don't grow on bushes, they grow on trees, are in play. And some of those trees, talk about timelines, some of those trees will take a decade and a half to grow. So if you want to solve that by 2050 and it's a decade and a half process, let's say we target for 2045, give us 5 years buffer. Something that takes 15 years to grow will have to be planted in 2030. That's real. For a tree to be planted in 2030, it's going to have to be tested in a field trial for 4 to 5 years. That field trial needs to start in 2025. For that field trial to start in 2025, you need to grow it in the greenhouse, in a research facility like NC State, for 2 to 3 years to know they can make it. And now we have to grow it in a tree house in 2022, and need to grow it in the lab in 2019 to do that. And ask for that project funding in 2018, and bring the resources that need to do that in 2017, and on and on and on. So unless we started like 4 or 5 years ago, we're not going to make 2050. That's the reality of the enterprise and the challenge that we're trying to address here. And if we want to make 2050, forget about 2030, it's too late. Forget about 2040, it's too late. We're looking at a boat, right, that's going to take 2050. And unless we're already 4 or 5 years in, it can't happen. We're looking at 2060. So I'm glad that we're already doing that, because otherwise we have no chance at having a real impact for a sustainable forest by 2050.
So can you explain what that almond tree, how would that differ from a regular almond tree?
Chestnut.
Okay, whatever.
Chestnut.
But, well, if we're talking about food, though,
Oh, you
this
talk
is the
about almond tree
hypothetical.
or chestnut?
Chestnut, go ahead.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
that was your question.
yeah, so how would that differ then? I mean, obviously, we have a problem with the chestnut trees being blighted, right? So this would just be a blight resistant?
Blast resistance, absolutely. But I think besides insect resistance, fungal resistance, viral resistance, bacterial resistance, right? Antifungal, anti-insecticidal, and the like, we're going to need to work on water, and we're going to need to work on heat. So now we're going to have to breed a chestnut that is more resistant to an increase in temperature that we real by 2050. If we want to breed this using classical breeding techniques, it's going to take 10 to 15 years to breed that. 15 years from now, 2039, we're going to plant a tree. It's not going to make it by 2050. So we have to use genome editing technologies to replicate naturally existing genotypes that enable drought resistance and breed those in commercially relevant elite germplasm so we can plant that and they're going to make it. Unless we know that right now, this is where machine learning comes in, genetics comes in, sequencing comes in. We need a lot of other technologies that help us inform those processes. Unless we have that right now, we can't do it. So we can only prioritize the genetic enhancement and improvement and breeding of traits and genes that we know today that are already in the literature. So we're thinking about, like things like wind resistance, right? Like what's the ability of the tree, to stand straight or not, or grow efficiently, or combinations thereof. And that's not trivial, and sadly enough, we don't know enough about tree genetics. As someone who's married to a tree geneticist, you hear about this
It's
all day,
true.
every day, right?
But that's not limited to trees.
It's
so,
very
yeah.
difficult, and we're just talking about trees here. So if it's hard today to edit disease out of human genomes, which it is, rest assured, like billions of dollars and armies of thousands of scientists to do it in FDA-enabled, clinically tested processes, we're years behind in agriculture. And we're decades behind in forestry. So this is what we need institutions like NC State with good knowledge of tree genetics to lead the effort. And even then, I'm not even sure we can do that by 2050. And that blows my mind
Yeah.
when I think about timelines and scale. And if you think of having an impact and the scale at which this extreme genome editing will be deployed, right? How many trees do we actually need to grow to feed humankind? How many hectares, right? How many acres? depending on the
Maybe we
unit that
can
you like.
have something other than trees to feed us.
Well, that's mush. Full circle here.
Maybe a little fruit, another thing. So I think what is exciting for the public may not be the same that scientists are excited about, So I think the Neanderthal is going to be excited about the mammoth, if that's food, So if you consider that food. But for the scientists, for us, the exciting things are really disease resistance, extreme weather resistance, whether it's flooding or heat or any of those. Those are the things really getting into those issues are really the breakthroughs. Recently, the tomato obviously was kind of cool. The purple tomato was interesting and cool. Nothing that will change the world. I don't want to play it down. I think it's awesome what you did. But the tomato will not change the world. What will change the world is having materials that can be made and produced sustainably without petroleum. I think I'm going to a congress next week where it is all about using trees for clothing and get away from cotton. Cotton is one of the worst things they're so toxic in terms of what needs to be used in herbicides and all of this. You can use trees, you can have fruits and nuts from a tree, and at the same time use the material for insulation, for clothing, for everything else. How awesome is that? So those are the things that I think scientists are more excited about, and how can we make several different traits combined that we don't understand yet. But I think those, and really expanding the possibility of what can be grown where. So I think different things are.
So if you go back to food, Marsha, right, to answer your question. So I'm sure people in the audience have enjoyed a seedless.
Seedless. I hear you.
Seedless product, right? Seedless grapes. I mean, like the grapes with the big seeds, very different in terms of enjoyment of the flavor and the texture than a seedless grape. I think most people would agree with that. We've had both. We could do a test here. We should have done that. Brought some seedless grapes and whatnot. So there's people who are like, wow, that sounds like an interesting idea. Maybe it's not fiction. Maybe it's real science. Maybe we can take seeds and pits out of other stuff. Like I would love a pitless avocado. Right? And guess what? People are working on this. How about like a pitless cherry? Well, guess what? People are working on this. So I like the idea, right? If we think about food, but it's not going to take us 30 years to do that. I mean, not with CRISPR. Right? And some means and some vision and some aspirations, right? So can we genetically edit some of those species to remove the seeds like we did in the grapes? in products that we enjoy that we don't want seeds in.
Maybe let's get some ideas and ask them what they would
Yeah,
like
well,
to
what do
see.
you guys want?
Yeah.
If you could take
And actually,
the seeds or the
it is
pits
time
out
to
of,
open up the floor to questions.
Maybe we'll ask the
So
questions
if you have
first,
any
right?
requests or questions, this is the
Yeah,
time.
any requests?
for seedless or pitless things.
Yeah, I was going to jump somewhere else, if that's okay, in terms
Please.
of requests. Just thank you for the panel. Very, very good insights. My name is Mary-Lise. I run Sustainable Food Ventures, so we invest in future food companies around the whole globe. We have one of our portfolio companies here working on cell-based milk, so milk without the cow.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm personally curious with enough resources and maybe it's infinite amount of time that we need, but do you think at any point in the future humans will be able to photosynthesis? So we just like go outside and bathe in the sun and then eat for pleasure, whether it's a seedless cherry or it's a seedless thing. Is that like, we can discuss whether it's necessary, but do you think it's even possible?
No.
Practically, I mean, do you want to grow branches and?
I mean, I could have green skin with like,
Yeah, it's not quite how that
Well,
works.
you can get a tattoo, but I don't think so. I don't think you will have it for two reasons. One is that people like to eat, and when you photosynthesize, you don't need to eat. You know, so that's an issue. The other thing is when the whole molecular side of photosynthesis is really not trivial, and sure, we can. It's probably possible to make you a tattoo. Actually, I should go one step back. Maybe I don't say no. There is actually a snail that eats algae and can incorporate the chloroplasts, which are the organelles that actually make the photosynthesis, and they can live off these organelles for about 8 to 9 months, and then they die off. So there are examples in nature that can do it. Is it desirable? I like to eat, I'm sorry. So I would, you know.
So if I retort the question, right, like what could we do? Maybe that's more like scientifically feasible that I'd be interested in getting. Like if I, that I could take it off later on and edit it out. I'd love to grow wings.
Yeah.
Like I could fly and hang out and see the scenery from somewhere else. I don't know how big I want the wings to be truly or how I want to go. I'd have to think about it.
green ones.
Photovoltaic
Okay.
wings.
I think we're working on that.
But I mean, like how practical, how desirable, how efficient, how reasonable it is, I'm not sure. I like to dream that I can do that, so I'd rather have a machine plugged into my brain that makes me feel like I'm flying, and then just wake up and be like, okay, that was great, like virtual reality in my brain.
They call
Good
that
enough.
VR.
Yeah, but in my brain and in my eye. So I think the physiology behind photosynthesis is not trivial whatsoever. The organs, the genes, the pathways, the processes involved. And since I have some French genetic inheritance, I would never give up eating anyway, and certainly not drinking.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Kind of going back to like the ethics side of things, and I guess this is a bit of like a two-part question, but how are you making sure, working to make sure that genetically modified foods, for example, are going to be actually affordable to grow, so that you don't have mega corporations being the only ones who can afford to grow genetically modified foods, and then local farmers in rural economies in both the U.S. and around the world aren't basically out of a job.
So what we do with my lab, we go out into countries where these technologies are not well established and train other researchers. So for example, in Peru or in Ghana, or they come here to learn these technologies. And it's not expensive to make them. So you could have co-ops, theoretically. You could have a co-op that requests engineering of a potato or a jam or whatever you're interested in, a blueberry, and you could they would have to go through all of that themselves, and they could do this. The reason that these big companies right now, the semi-monopolies you're probably thinking about, have all these rights is because of the regulations. So the regulations, more before, but it's coming down, but it costs 10, 15 years. I don't know, the tree, the chestnut is going to be a nightmare. It has been a nightmare for 20 years to get it out. And then to get through all this regulatory stuff is just, and patents is incredibly expensive. If that comes down and there is a better regulatory system that really allows access to market and a better way to evaluate this, and I think that's on the horizon, you know, because we have better methods to test all of this. We can go after all these questions. Is this healthy? Is this toxic? Is it with a lot less money than we used to? We are much better in producing them. And if we train more people with different interest background, I think that's the way to go.
So as a matter of fact, it's one of the perverse effects
Yeah.
of big tech, right? Is that a select few number of well-funded corporations have a near monopoly or duopoly or tetrapoly on big ag to some extent until now. Because to be able to do it, to be able to afford the licenses to do it, and then to be able to go through the regulatory frameworks and hoops you got to jump through to do it, you have to be a multi-billion-dollar corporation. That's what's great about CRISPR, because it's been democratized. So CRISPR has been shared by Addgene. You can do addgene.org, not-for-profit in Boston, Massachusetts, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, technically. Has been shipped to not-for-profit organizations 250,000 times across 104 different countries, including parts of the world that are not sophisticated per se, because those technologies are now affordable and can be deployed by the average lab in an average setting with the average academic capabilities to democratize the technology and make it accessible using protocols that are published online. And doing CRISPR is another hard part. Being able to do CRISPR in a plant that's commercially relevant and productive and desirable is the hard part, and combining that. And then knowing what to edit is a challenge, but there's literature there as well. So the tool itself is pretty much democratized. That's what's great about this, as opposed to classical GM until now, where the price is cost prohibitive and the level of difficulty and scientific sophistication and equipment you need to have to be able to do it, not accessible at all. So that's the game changer. That's one of the reasons why genome editing is so ubiquitous and accessible from a scientific standpoint. The IP I'm not going to talk about. It's complicated. And it brings us to the third limiting factor, which is regulations. And that's where, depending on the jurisdiction you're in, depending on where you want to sell it, it's going to be hyper variable. But there are parts of the world that are open to it and where it's going to be a game changer. And the World Economic Forum is convinced and has stated on the record that by 2030, right, 7 years from now, 7 years and 3 months from now, 100 million farms may have planted a gene-edited seed across the world. 100 million farms, that's 15% of all the food supply chain. Whether it will happen, how quickly it's going to happen, scientifically I'm not concerned. In terms of regulations and public acceptance, we'll see. But the partial monopoly that some of those corporations have had is going away thanks to technologies like this.
And by the way, that's a close-up on the one seed that's being planted that will change the world. That's the beginning of the movie plot. Cut through a bunch of farms, and it's the one seed that goes in the ground and what comes out. So I'm afraid we're out of time. Do I have time for one more question? Okay, we have time for one more question.
I'll try to make this one count. So I guess one of them, this is also from like an agricultural friend, would increasing food yields through genetic engineering and everything, would that actually be beneficial, or would that increase the amount of waste that's left, the amount of food that's left wasting in fields? just like already they don't have enough like workers to harvest all the food, so there's a lot of food that just gets wasted. So would increasing yield actually help?
I think that's a societal problem and not a scientific engineering problem. So, you know, it's if you make products that you can make products that are better in the field that don't rot as fast. You can make we could engineer things that or they are natural tomatoes. When you take tomatoes, you have kinds of tomatoes that all ripen at the same time. That's pretty difficult. Because then you have a lot of everything you don't use at that time that rots. And then we have tomato kinds naturally, which ripen over time. It's always one flower here, one flower there. You need more workers that are constantly in the field. And so, but those are really market and societal issues and not issues. We can engineer the one into the other, back and forth, or we can engineer things that where you can induce the ripening. You say, okay, the next 3 weeks are going to be nice and dry before we get the bad cold season. Let's ripen everything now. We could do that. You know, we could use a light or we could use a chemical or whatever to get them to do that. But you need the workers, you need, you know, those are other problems. You need to fix your immigration system. You have farm workers, you know. That's not something that genetic engineering can fix. You know, that's a societal, political issue.
Yeah, again, I would concur 100% with Heike here. There are geopolitical constraints and supply chain and accessibility constraints that are independent of the genome editing itself. But I think increasing yield at a time of water constraints and land constraints and resources constraints is still a very good idea. How much more we need to enhance it, I think, you know, it depends on the context, it depends on the crop, or a product in question, and the location, obviously. But I think if we could increase yields more for the time being, we'd benefit from that from a sustainability standpoint.
If anyone did not try it on the way in, there is a genetically altered pink pineapple out on the table that Karen brought in, and you are welcome to try it on your way out. And are there any parting announcements beyond that? I would like to thank Rafeeat and Heike and Rodolphe for being on this panel, and thank you all for coming and spending the afternoon with us. Have a good rest of your day.
I should have watched more movies. Well done.
We should read more books too.